everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host. We have a lot of news to cover, so let's get started. Unfortunately, we begin today with yet another police shooting following the recent shootings that have included high-profile cases such as Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Today, we move down to Atlanta, Georgia, where there was a police shooting of Rashard Brooks that sparked demonstrations both in the streets, on the interstate, as well as in the Wendy's parking lot in which this event occurred. So let's get into it. So again, the man was 27 years old. His name was Rashard Brooks, and he was killed in an incident with a police officer who shot him in the back twice. Now, this murder does, again, follow a string of high-profile police killings that have shocked the country and sparked protests, demonstrations, some violence, everywhere from Los Angeles to New York. I've already covered what's happened in Seattle, but we can talk about that more, and I will keep you guys updated. But just to do an aside really quickly, there are people in Seattle who've taken over 2 different police precincts at this point, who are calling for the absolute defunding of the police, who are making demands of the government, and they are, anyway, the point is this has sparked a lot of protests, a lot of outcry, a lot of outrage, rightfully so. This is another name on this man was 27 years old, and this is another name on a very long list of names. And by the way, it should be noted that Brooks was on his way to, he was at some point planning on taking his daughter out skating for her birthday that weekend, and she was waiting for him to come home, and he never came home, which is really, really hard to read about. But according to reports, Brooks fell asleep at the wheel of his car while waiting in a Wendy's drive-thru in Atlanta. When officers checked on him and administered a sobriety test, Brooks continued to take and fail the sobriety test. At that point, police attempted to apprehend Brooks and take him into custody, and Brooks was hesitant, and Brooks and the officers started to become physically involved, and then Brooks managed to get his hand on the taser of the officer and break free from his grip. And it was at that point, there's some mixed reports, but what it seems like happened is that at that point Brooks started running away, and maybe at some point he turned around, and somewhere in that space is when the officer Garrett Rolfe shot and killed Brooks. Now this officer Rolfe has since been fired. The Atlanta Police Chief Erica Shields has since resigned, leaving the rest of the process up to the interim police chief and the city mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who had this to say about Brooks' murder, quote, "While there may be debate as to whether this was an appropriate use of deadly force, I firmly believe that there is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do." And I would like to add to that I think this was not a justified use of force. I think this person was not threatening at all. At the very worst, they had a stun gun and they were shot and killed. So I do not think that this called for that force. I do not. I think this was yet again a clear abuse of force. And I'm not sure if it's cultural, and I'm not sure if we just don't report on good interactions with police, but it seems like this is happening a lot, and there has been a pattern of behavior that has been demonstrated, and I think that is safe to say. That said, this is still a developing story. I will be sure to keep you guys updated tomorrow when you join me here again. Moving on with other news, the president is thinking about withdrawing troops from Europe. So we will start. This is a dilemma in the White House regarding possible withdrawal of troops who are stationed in Germany. The hypothetical withdrawal actually, in a weird way, this instance of withdrawing troops is not bipartisan, but generally that term is actually quite bipartisan, and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about some other things related to that, but politicians such as Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, this president have called for an end to sort of unsuccessful, never-ending military campaigns, military engagements during the campaign season in 2015 leading up to the election of 2016. Donald Trump made it clear that he doesn't think that our allies are carrying their weight, especially militarily, so this is something that's also been a part of his agenda since the day he was elected. All of this said, President Trump has not yet signed any legislation or any executive order that specifically mandates the withdrawal of troops, again, in this case, from Germany. Now, the National Security Council spokesman has issued a statement saying that the president, quote, continually reassesses the best posture for the United States, unquote, which is a good, I mean, that's what every president should be doing, right? I mean, that's something that all presidents do. That's something that all world leaders do, I should say, excuse me. But the move would hypothetically remove up to 9,000 of the total 35,000 troops that are currently stationed in Germany, although this move is probably more political than anything because the president, again, has made it clear that one of his missions is to make it, so, I guess like make this a better deal. I don't know. The point is the president does not feel that certain allies are carrying their weight as far as their own defense, and the United States is picking up the tab, and whether or not that is true, in any case, withdrawal is on the table. Now, talks of withdrawing troops from Germany have sparked concern from even some Republican members of the House Armed Services Committee who wrote a letter to the president warning him of the danger of withdrawal from a strategic perspective because it could, quote, significantly damage U.S. national security. In addition, these committee members said that this move would empower Russia and jeopardize the posture of the United States abroad, all of which is true. If you want to do something really good for Russia and do something really good for China, withdraw your forces from Europe and from Asia. Now, the notion of withdrawing troops is complicated by withdrawing troops, whether you view it favorably or unfavorably depends on your end goal. It also depends on the end goal for our allies, who our allies are, and understanding the strategy and end goal of our adversaries. Really, the crux of the problem is that we want to involve U.S. troops, in my opinion, only as much as necessary. I'm sort of a minimalist there. I think that in some places you do need U.S. troops for hard power and for soft power purposes. But that said, I'm a minimalist, and I think that we should do it to a minimal scale. I don't think that we have to maximize every single engagement or every single point of station. That said, from another perspective, withdrawing troops actually might be a step that could precipitate peace in theory. I mean, in a way, I mean, if you think about something like the democratic peace thesis, the idea is that if we just, are all democracies, then we won't go to war. If we have just equal representative governments, we won't need to go to war. That thesis has been widely criticized, and I'm obviously reducing it a lot for the purposes of this show. But in any case, a lot of people generally think of withdrawal as a good thing in the sense that, people associate troops abroad with these very long-term military engagements, such as the state-building project in Afghanistan that really has been a puzzle. And now, withdrawal is really sort of a complicated subject because it's compounded by what the implication would be, right? Which is the fact that whatever is left behind would just be left to their own devices. And it's sometimes hard to tell whether or not people would be better off with some engagement from abroad and from other countries or without engagement. And let's look at Afghanistan, for example. Afghanistan is a puzzle because people on the ground in the country have vocalized their concerns and their desire for peace, overwhelmingly. That said, there's even been a peace deal that was struck last February. But for political reasons and for strategic reasons, we can't agree on the exact specifics of certain ceasefire deals, of releasing certain soldiers from captivity, and certain power sharing arrangements moving forward. So it's hard to say whether or not a state necessarily is better off after a withdrawal. So this has sort of been a bipartisan question. Do we stay or do we not stay? And this has been around since as long as we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Syria and in many other countries around, well over 100 countries around the world. Now, the author of an article at the Washington Post says something very interesting about this, saying, quote, "We should spend what it costs to keep Americans safe, no more, no less." Now, number one, it's much easier said than done to do that, but it's also easier when you refrain from saying specifics. No more, no less. like I was saying, I'm also a minimalist, but how much involvement does that mean? I'm not really qualified to say how much involvement we need to have. I'm just saying I think I would agree with that. We only need as much as we need, but who's to say what that actually means? Now, and this is a problem with the language that we use to describe solutions to these very complicated foreign policy issues. And this is really indicative also, just by the way, of the complete disarray in Washington. But really, one of the problems also here is that we continuously commit to these quasi-direct or direct military engagements where the end goal is not so clear, the enemy is not so clear. We've seen these sort of ideological more wars like Vietnam, for example, where you're not really fighting any group in particular. I mean, you are, but you're really trying to stop communism, and that's, I mean, how do you stop the spread of an idea? Even if you really disagree with the idea, and even if the idea results in terrible regimes later on under Joseph Stalin and other people, you can't stop ideas from spreading. And the truth really about withdrawal is, again, it depends on our goal. And if our goal is peace building and is state building, then it's really got to be obviously a blend of some local activity, but it's hard to know the extent to which people like the United States or the United Nations or other foreign or international actors should be involved. We see this in Afghanistan and Syria, in Iraq, and even in Yemen. That said, let's move on to a different piece, other news, a piece in the Washington Post by Stanford professor Brian Lowry, who's writing about the abolition of the police and what a world without police would look like. Now, this article really is in many ways anecdotal about his interactions with his own personal white friends, his experiences as an African American man in the United States and with police. And one important question in the article that he asks of his white friends that he often says that he is asked, which is, "Are you okay?" This question, "Are you okay?" Was the refrain of many of his white colleagues, he said, after these high-profile police killings. And he interestingly actually said that he usually turns the question around back to his friends, and he says, "Are you okay? Are you okay with watching this sort of thing happen, knowing that this is going on in your country, not my country, like our country? Like, are you okay with that?" Because at this point, I think it's implied who would be upset in this situation. So I think that was an interesting thing in this article. Now, Lowry actually goes on, and I'll just quote some of the article. He goes, "Are you okay? Are you okay after seeing a Minneapolis police officer casually pressing the life out of George Floyd? Are you okay after learning that police rushed in and shot Breonna Taylor, a woman not accused of wrongdoing, in her own apartment? Are you okay after watching 3 white men chase and kill Ahmaud Arbery? Are you okay after watching an apparently liberal woman functionally weaponize her whiteness in Central Park?" I thought this was a really powerful passage that really is touching on a lot of themes in America, past and present, and I hope not in the future. I'd also like to add that, for me, obviously, I would say that no, I'm not okay with all of this, and this is why I'm here, by the way, trying to speak about it and actually, cover this stuff and bring it to attention, or bring it to light, because I'm not okay with it, and I literally don't want to speak. And for the record, a lot of people right now are saying stuff like silence is violence, and here I am, not being silent. So I'm vocalizing it. I'm not okay with all of this. I'm not okay with police brutality. I'm not okay with racism. I'm not okay with murder. I'm not okay with abuse of power. I'm really skeptical of authority, period, including the police. And I'm really not okay with the dehumanization of African American people, and police officers abusing their power to the point of murder on several occasions. To that point, I just think that really we need to work our way toward peace. And what I hope to see happen is that people who are speaking about this keep in mind that we need to work strategically toward justice. I've been thinking about this quote a lot lately, and it's something that I just think really is important with this article. And there's an old quote, I believe, from Sun Tzu that says, "A wise fighter is never angry." So, yes, hold on to your anger, but also I think if we really want justice and equality and you want to get people where it hurts, then you need to take a deep breath focus and then really evaluate the situation and determine how are you actually going to get to the justice that you seek. I say that with a lot of privilege and luxury, but I still think that it's true. Lowry mentions an interesting Frederick Douglass quote, who I'm a big fan of Frederick Douglass, and one of his quotes, that's been echoed so many times is, "Without struggle, there is no progress." And that doesn't mean struggle is good, but from struggle you can generate a lot of progress. And obviously the struggle in this case is really a journey of 1,000 steps for white people to start understanding and for justice to start happening. And the ability to really understand my own privilege, your own privilege is necessary, and it's good. And these are necessary steps that we need to take toward dismantling systems that really do perpetuate inequality. And I just think that this is a very interesting article from Lowry, who really is able to talk about his lived experiences a lot as someone who's been discriminated against, and just why every moment is different and why everything is just completely different. It's a completely different world. And so I think that that's something I'm trying to understand more. And so I think I would encourage people to go read this article on the Washington Post and start talking with their friends more, and actually start even, without even getting positional about the police question, and abolishing the police, just at least talking to your friends and stuff about authority figures and how police can start to earn back the trust of people in this country. That said, there's another piece at the New York Times that really does sort of entertain this idea of what would a world without police look like. Now, that maybe that doesn't mean there's no law enforcement, but what would a world without our current police structure look like? Now, a lot of the speech is about reform, which is really good. But I do have to say I don't totally agree with some of these more revolutionary tendencies. I'm definitely glad that we're having definitive policy change, because I think that is a good start. But for example, for people who want to defund the police, I actually think that police departments need more funding, but with strings attached, so that way they can have longer programs, better programs that are more comprehensive, with better training across the board in a wide variety of important factors and elements that are involved in our communities, and training, in social work and cultural competency and nonviolent dialogue and all sorts of things. So I actually think that requires more funding, or at least the same amount of funding now. So that's one place where I sort of think, actually, if we want to get the goal, if our end goal is justice, then we need more funding. But that said, there's an interesting piece that was over the weekend in the New York Times, from Mariam Kamba, that she really describes the historical marginalization of African American people by police officers, which has been undeniable, but is just highlighted in the news repeatedly. Kaba goes on to say that she's actually been advocating for the abolition of police for years. And this is a very interesting thing, because this is just now coming to the forefront in our dialogue. And again, the decision you make here depends on your end goal. If your end goal is to create more chaos in our communities, more harm, then we should keep burning them down. We should keep defunding the police and advocating for that, and we will result in a real life Lord of the Flies role play situation. However, if your end goal is reform, equality, actual justice, love, peace, just decency, then there are much wiser mechanisms, I think, than just completely abolishing law enforcement. Again, I'm obviously coming from a place of luxury and privilege, and that's important to say. The police really the police treat me as much better because of my skin color than other people, than non-white people in this country. And that's a powerful thing. But again, if the end goal is justice, I think that then we can't shoot ourselves in the foot. We have to take a deep breath, remember that quote, "The wise fighter is never angry," come back to center, and then really think about how we achieve justice. Things like the Floyd family saying, like, voting different people in who will create the reform that you seek. That's a great place to start. local, state, and federal elections. Start voting. That is a great place to start. A third of the country didn't vote in 2016. I hope that's not the same in 2020. Go vote. That said, this has also been a really tough mission for Congress to just come up with a solution that is really going to satisfy everybody, because Congress has to come up with some bill that's going to satisfy Democrats, that's going to satisfy the public, that's going to satisfy Republicans, enough on each team to actually pass. And it's got to satisfy people that are really, really upset and completely distrust any institutions of law enforcement. So, there's an African American member of the Senate, the only African American Republican member of the Senate, Tim Scott from South Carolina, who has really been tasked with the creation of a police reform bill that is supposed to at least assuage civil unrest and pass again with enough support from both Democrats and Republicans in Congress to actually become a law. According to Politico, one of Scott's main concerns is the distrust of American institutions altogether. People do not trust Congress. People do not trust the president. People do not trust law enforcement. People do not trust each other. Now, I'm not speaking on behalf of everybody, but I definitely think that resonates with a large group of people in this country right now. And the point is, our social fabric is really disintegrating in the absence of trust in our institutions, and that trust is rightfully so, because our institutions are becoming corrupted and are abusing their power. But in any case, Tim Scott issued a statement saying, quote, "There are literally tens of millions of Americans who've lost confidence in institutions that have authority," which is absolutely true. This level of skepticism, though, did not happen overnight, by the way. This is something that happens over the course of years and years and years. And this sentiment actually, has been pointed out in articles lately, for some people, this distrust has been there for centuries, has been present for centuries of abuse and mistrust and racial slurs and police malpractice and so the skepticism has been building for centuries. So this reform bill, there's a lot really on the table here, and this reform bill is an incredible opportunity to create change that really could end centuries of police malpractice targeting African Americans, abusing African Americans, really also, I should say, abusing Americans, period, white and non-white. The police in this country has has a history that really is in some ways rife with violent behavior, and it is quite concerning. That said, I hope that enough Democrats and Republicans in Congress can compromise for once, for the sake of a safer world, some actual reform, earning back the trust of Americans. Now, Senator Scott plans on releasing this police reform bill later this month, and again, he needs to please a majority of Democrats, please maybe enough independents and Republicans, and also meet the needs of the moment, if you will. Now, according to Politico, Scott is not really interested in aggressive government regulation. Instead, he wants to incentivize officers to improve their behavior. So opponents of this bill, such as Cory Booker and Kamala Harris from California, claim that this bill really will not go far enough to hold officers accountable for their actions. Scott really does not share this concern, but speaking on the record, Senator Kamala Harris had this to say, quote, "I haven't read it yet, but the little I know about it, it does not meet the moment or the needs of the moment." By the way, obviously, I don't think it's wise to chide a document with which you have not been familiarized because you haven't read it. That said, welcome to politics. Welcome to Washington. That's not unique to her. That's what people in politics do. Oh yeah, I haven't read something. I'm not familiar with it. I have no facts, but it's wrong. Again, this is just another reason why we don't trust our institutions or our politics, because of stuff like that. Moving on, so we're back to coronavirus, by the way. I know it seems like we sort of forgot about it for a few weeks there. There were some other things going on that were pretty hot, that were really, really tragic and intense, and so we sort of took a break, but we're back. So moving on from police reform bills to an update on the coronavirus, which really has made a sudden reappearance in the news, in the mainstream. A recently discovered report from China details a coronavirus outbreak in Beijing. which resulted in the closure of a market in which dozens of people were infected. According to the New York Times, this is the highest single-day virus count for China in 2 months, which could be an indicator that the reopening process was not handled responsibly, or people just maybe people actually themselves do not go about things responsibly. In any case, one important part of this article is the fact that the city is increasing their testing capacity. So basically, I should say, a new infection is different from a newly discovered patient. So anytime a city is going to start increasing their testing, it's likely that they will find it's likely that they will find new carriers. So I should say that part of this is compounded by the fact that they're also increasing their testing in the city of Beijing, and because they're increasing their testing, that means that they're discovering new viruses and new cases new cases at the same time as people are actually getting infected in real time. So this is a really cyclical, compounded issue. Now, the Beijing Health Commission reported that an overwhelming amount of new cases were found in people who had worked or who had shopped at a certain seafood and produce market that supplies up to 90% of Beijing's fruit and vegetables. There are 10,000 employees that work at this market in the city, in which it is suspected that the virus was brought via imported salmon. This has sparked, quote, warlike measures from the Chinese government, especially because the original outbreak in Wuhan also occurred at a seafood market, and thirdly, because this is the country of origin for the virus. So it's particularly important that they are very cautious about reopening. Now, data from the Times says that China has had roughly 90,000 cases and under 5,000 deaths, which again seems really, really almost impossible for the fact that that was the country of origin, but they had quite a strict lockdown, which again, a strict lockdown, people are staying home, they're not developing antibodies, and then people go out and they infect each other. All of that said, it's fascinating to see the media focus really on coronavirus for a while, then sort of pivot away from it and then come back to coronavirus, because for a little while there, if you were someone who was concerned about coronavirus, then people thought you were being insensitive. But now you're sensitive again if you care about coronavirus. So honestly, I am getting a little frustrated with that. But in any case, it is an important thing to cover. And now, I just want to say that it's just sort of interesting in the beginning. We go back to March. Demonstrators in the streets are just being diminished and dehumanized, and people are saying you just want a haircut, even though you might have just lost your entire livelihood, your business, your financial future, your retirement. And people are diminishing that and saying, oh, you really just want a haircut. But then thousands of people start marching in the streets, without recognizing social distancing protocols, without taking certain precautions. And I understand why people would want to meet in the streets, but the point is the media basically flip-flop back and forth, and they want to pretend like they haven't done that, but they have done that. And this is part of the reason why people don't trust the mainstream media, just by the way. In any case, it is deniable that several of these protests really have been about several different things. It's been about the police killings. It's been about the unemployment. It's been about the economic depression generally. It's been about everything that's tied to that, losing your financial future, your retirement, defaulting on loans, having credit card debt, all of that basically. And then on top of all of that, several police killings in a row, just created a perfect storm for outrage and public outcry. And I think all of these issues are connected to each other. And I really think that what's going on is that this government is failing to articulate the needs and meet the needs and even the wants of their own people. That's what's going on. I mean, we need new government. I don't need big government or small government. We need new government. We need new government. And I just, despite all the confusion, I just think that, we need to be listening to experts more often. So including our health officials, we need to be listening who are saying that coronavirus is going to keep spiking. If we're not careful, China, Beijing could be a warning for some other states in the United States, such as Florida and Georgia and other states. But also it's like, how do we know that we can trust these institutions that have not been consistent, that have gone back and forth, and have even covered up for wrongdoing? I mean, originally the virus was covered up, and now we're supposed to believe that the government's really, really concerned about it? I mean, I don't know what to believe. And I think that it's, furthermore, it's really sad that I don't know what to believe, but that is the problem, I think. The problem is that people do not know what to believe anymore. People do not know who they can trust anymore. People do not know what to value anymore. They don't know where to go anymore for information. And that's the biggest problem. People do not know where to go for information where they feel like it's not being just filtered through so much agenda and bias that it's just distorted. And that's what I'm trying to do, but I even catch myself doing it all the time. Now, the point is, health officials again have sort of returned to this fear about reopening too soon and spreading the coronavirus. And this actually brings us to a very interesting study that was published in the Washington Post that suggests, from work from many other studies, that wearing masks actually does help. So, in other words, maybe the fact that maybe people who are sitting here today saying this thing was overblown, maybe for those people it wasn't. It's just that we all wore masks, or at least most of us, and it actually did prevent the spread of the virus. So it's hard to know if we went back and never wore masks or locked down at all. It's hard to know what would have happened. But in any case, I just think that this is a very interesting study. Now we also should, just to contextualize this, the mandate to wear a mask in public spaces really was met with a lot of criticism, especially from skeptics who pointed out that authoritative figures such as Dr. Anthony Fauci, had mixed language. We all saw that 60 Minutes interview in which he said masks might help, but probably not. But then he goes out and tells people you need to wear them, and people get confused. That said, according to the Washington Post, there is, quote, a spate of new research that supports wearing masks to control the coronavirus spread. The key thing here to understand about the masks is their efficacy, or how effective they are at stopping the spread of the virus, which is the end goal, so that way we don't overwhelm ourselves or the hospital systems or any healthcare systems. Now, in the months since the outbreak, political partisans, again, have really poisoned the notion of wearing a mask and distorted it. And now it's really a statement where you're either not wearing it because you care more about civil liberty, or you're wearing it because you care more about collective responsibility. And it's really, really annoying, actually. But moving on, focusing on these studies, there were several studies that were released this month that support the notion that wearing a mask does prevent the spread of the virus. One of these studies, which was supported by the World Health Organization, was published in the magazine Lancet. This study determined that wearing a face mask does conclusively reduce the risk of spreading the virus. This is after reviewing data from over 170 studies. This conclusion is really interesting, and it's significant. However, another thing that we still have, the question is, so we know that it reduces risk, but by how much? Does it only reduce risk by a marginal amount? Meaning, if I just look the other way and don't talk to you directly, then it's the same thing. I mean, how much does it reduce the risk? What is the risk reduction multiplier? That's really the question. Now, as the coronavirus numbers gradually decreased over the months of March and April and May, people stopped, following these guidelines from health officials closely, especially with some of the people in the streets who've been demonstrating or protesting. And it turns out that, this actually, ironically, we still resulted in a smaller epidemic, but it's hard to know, I guess what I'm saying is, if we went back in time and no one wore a mask and no one locked down, it's hard to know where we would be. So again, it's like the masks are good, but we can't really know the other situation, and they do reduce the risk, but again, by how much? So that's one of the problems with this data. And some of the researchers actually themselves are not even super confident in their findings. The author of the review, Holger Schoenemann, he is an epidemiologist at McMaster University in Ontario, issued a statement in which he said, quote, "Our findings suggest in multiple ways that the use of masks is highly protective in healthcare and community settings," which is pretty specific. However, Xinwen continued to say that they, quote, have low certainty in those results, which again makes for a really confusing scenario for people who just are following the story, who are following the news, who want to know mask, no mask, mask, no mask. Well, it turns out a lot of the data is not super conclusive in one direction or another. In any case, it is important to read these studies, I think, and to understand that the data is compiled from hundreds of different studies, and so it's difficult to draw a definitive conclusion because everybody's different. It's hard. There are so many different environments in which we socialize and gather or can possibly isolate. There are so many possible points of contact to trace. It's really hard to know. Furthermore, this article is just one of tens or hundreds of articles really that's in this huge body of literature about the coronavirus that we have now that I even myself am having trouble keeping up with. So I would encourage you guys to go hear what the experts have to say, go read online about what the experts have to say, because I certainly am not an expert. In that spirit though, that concludes today's episode. I appreciate your time. If you enjoy my content and you'd like to support me, please subscribe to the channel and like this video down below. Additionally, there is a link in the description down there to my Patreon page where you can sign up and make a donation to support me. I will see you here again tomorrow. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show.